In the reading from chapter 36 of 2nd Chronicles today, we hear or heard about how the Lord sent prophets to warn his people over and over that they needed to turn away from their sinful ways. And as we all know, the Bible is full of stories about the major and the minor prophets who tried to warn Israel over and over. Now, one of the better-known prophets of the Old Testament, of course, was Jonah, who was volunteered by God to go save Nineveh, which was the capital of ancient Assyria. At first, of course, Jonah refused, and in the course of trying to run away from God, we know that the next step in Jonah's story involved a big fish. But returning to the 2nd Chronicles reading, we read in verse 16 the following: "But they mocked God's messengers. They despised his words, and they scoffed at his prophets." We also know that in many cases, they actually killed God's prophets. Well, in a recent poll put out by Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, 75% of Americans identified themselves as Christians. But in a 1990 poll, the number of people identifying as Christians was 86%. And presumably, the number of Americans identifying as Christians would have been higher in earlier years if there had been a poll in the earlier years. One conclusion that's been drawn from the polling data is that apparently Americans are not switching to other religions from Christianity. Rather, the drop in Christianity comes from a radical shift toward individualism. And this interpretation of the polling data was offered by William Donahue, president of the Catholic League, which is a Roman Catholic civil rights organization. Now, another way to look at the data is simply to say that while atheists say there is no God, individualists put themselves ahead of God. Now, we might think that this sort of social cultural trend toward individualism does not bode well for the church. And I would tend to agree. For some churches, this rise in individualism will prove to be a severe time of testing. In fact, some churches won't survive. But for others, it may prove to be a case of being at the right place at the right time. So let's go back to the reading from 2nd Chronicles and take a look at verses 20 and 21. Starting at verse 20. "He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had made up for its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. Here we see that when the Babylonians overran Jerusalem in approximately 587 BC, God preserved a faithful remnant. Now clearly, this remnant underwent a severe period of testing and spent roughly 70 years in exile. But because of their enduring faith, God restored them to their homeland and gave them the means to rebuild. Now let's make no mistake about what's happening in our world today. The rise in individualism is going to have severe repercussions for both individual freedom and for the church. And that's because the individualist, while seeking the freedom to be an individualist, nonetheless seeks acknowledgement and, in fact, endorsement from institutions like the federal government or from the Episcopal Church to bless his or her individuality, no matter what direction that individuality may take, no matter how anti-Christian or sinful that individuality may be. In fact, we can already look to continental Europe or to Great Britain to see what the outcomes of this movement of individualism portends for us in America. Not only is free speech repressed, but religious institutions are coerced to step back from the core religious principles they stand on. And where coercion is not sufficient, legal action often follows. In this country, in our own denomination, we already see the battle lines being drawn between those parishes which will move like bottles on the ocean waves along with the individualist progression versus those parishes who will resist the tidal currents of fashion and stand firm for the faith delivered to us by the early church fathers.